Hey, Leah.
Hey, Fallon, and hey, listeners. We are the hosts of a podcast called The Secret Life of Canada. We are a history podcast.
Yeah, and we've covered topics, things like the gold rush or the Bay blanket.
Yes, kind of unconventional stories, though, that you might have missed in your Canadian history class.
So we're here to uncover those secrets.
That's right. Check us out wherever you get your podcasts.
This is a CBC podcast.
Danse, Anine, Boujou, hello and welcome. This is Unreserved on CBC Radio 1. I'm Rosanna Deerchild. History is a narrative of past events about a place, person, or time. But it's more than that. History shapes us, informs our present and future, and can inspire us to change. Indigenous history has often been left in the margins, hidden and untold. But more and more, we are seeing this history uncovered.
Both of them name a little girl as being the first jingle dress dancer, and the girl was actually a survivor of the global pandemic of a century ago.
And he really believed that once he proved the problem and gave them a solution, the government of Canada would do the right thing. Like, how could anyone allow these kids to die? They refused to do it.
I'll find pieces, and it's almost like they're children that have been adopted out. And I want so much to bring them home.
Today on Unreserved, little-known histories of Indigenous people and how the past informs the present and the future.
Hello, Tensei. My name is Charlotte Tutusis, and I am a jingle dress dancer from Brenda Child First Nation. Today I am offering a virtual sidestep healing dance for all the sickness in the world, aka coronavirus.
During the COVID-19 pandemic, women and girls across North America have been posting videos of themselves performing the jingle dress dance. It's a dance that has historical ties to another pandemic from 100 years ago.
Ojibwe people in the United States and Canada tell a similar story about the origins of the jingle dress dance tradition. They cite a young girl being very sick. Her father, after having a vision about a special dress and dance associated with it, gave the little girl the dress. She began dancing in the new jingle dress and survived.
That was University of Minnesota professor Brenda Child on the origin story of the jingle dress dance. Brenda is a member of the Red Lake Ojibwe Reservation in Minnesota, and she's been doing some research into the history of the jingle dress. She joins me from Minneapolis to tell us what she discovered. Welcome, Brenda.
Thank you so much.
What did you find was the origin of the jingle dress dance?
Well, I was really surprised when I started doing the research. I couldn't find a single photograph of what you would call a jingle dress before circa 1920 in the United States or Canada. And I thought, wow, as a historian, it occurred to me that something very big had happened that created this new healing tradition a century ago. So when I started doing further work into it, it seems that it was the big flu epidemic of 1919, very similar in some ways to the global pandemic we're experiencing today. And so the story, whether it's told in Whitefish Bay, Ontario, or central Minnesota on the Mille Lacs Reservation, both of them name a little girl as being the first jingle dress dancer. And the girl was actually a survivor of the global pandemic of a century ago.
And there was something else going on at the time, as well as this influenza pandemic. There was this law, I guess, outlawing Indigenous spirituality. So that really added to the power of the dress, right?
Yeah, it was. I like to say that the jingle dress dance was a radical tradition from its origins, because in the context of the United States, the Indian office in Washington had outlawed ritualistic dancing on reservations in this kind of infamous dance order of 1921. But it is true that the jingle dress dance emerged during a moment when these kinds of traditions were being suppressed on reservation communities. And so in that sense, the jingle dress dance was sort of a radical tradition from its beginning.
Very cool. Is there a history of new dances being created out of a specific need or issue that needs to be addressed in our communities?
Well, I mean, I think we have a tradition of new dances being created, but this is the first dance that I trace to a kind of global epidemic. And what's interesting to me is most of us know that Indian tribes in North America, ever since the coming of Europeans, experienced many different kinds of epidemics and pandemics and smallpox. And what the jingle dress dance sort of shows me is maybe this was a way that Native people had of coping with these earlier generations of epidemics as well.
Mm-hmm. How is the jingle dress itself connected to healing?
I think most Native people know that the jingles themselves are imbued with a kind of healing power. Ojibwe people think of spiritual power as being passed through the air. And so sound is very important in that worldview. And so if you've ever been to a powwow and you've had the wonderful experience of listening to many jingle dress dancers dancing together, you know, it's a really interesting sound in that it's a tinkling sound, but some people have described it as almost being like a summer rain or evoking sounds of a rainfall. What we learned this past year, my students and I at the University of Minnesota were putting together an exhibit for the Mille Lacs Indian Museum, thinking about it being the 100th anniversary of the jingle dress dance tradition. And we had an opportunity to look at dresses through the decades. And so from the 20s, the 30s, the 40s, 50s, and more recent years. And what we found is that the jingles over the years were made of different materials. We often think of the classic Copenhagen snuff can lid, and that has been a consistent material that Ojibwe people have used to make jingles. But we also saw dresses with Prince Albert tobacco cans. We also saw dresses made from baking soda cans early that.
Oh.
So people, American Indian women and Ojibwe women in particular, have been very creative. We had one early Dakota dress that had a jacket, both of them with jingles, and the skirt and the jacket were made of drapery fabric.
Wow. It sounds like jingle dress dancers were kind of contemporary in that they were able to go with the styles of the time.
They did. And in fact, some of my favorite dresses are the first ones from the collections at the Minnesota Historical Society. They're often black, kind of slim dresses that resemble the flapper dresses of the 1920s. Oh. And so it's surprising. And that's sort of one of the things we wanted to show with the exhibit, that in many ways, the jingle dress dance evolved through the decades. There isn't one consistent style, but the jingles are what they all have in common. A lot of the dresses from the 30s and 40s we found had long zinc zippers up the side, showing that they were probably purchased in department stores, and then were embellished later with jingles. And that's something that maybe would surprise some of us who always say, oh, you know, you have to make your own jingle dress or you have to have it made for you, because in the 1930s and 40s, women sometimes purchased them and added the jingles later.
I imagine many people think that powwow dancing has been around for hundreds of years, but as you say, the jingle dress dance and the dress itself is relatively new. How do people respond when you tell them that?
Well, I like to talk about that idea very much because many people can only see Indigenous people as historic peoples. I know we have that problem in the United States. We're sort of viewed as always in terms of the past. And so with the jingle dress, even though the powwow tradition is older than the jingle dress, what the jingle dress dance shows me is that Native people and Ojibwe people here in the Great Lakes were part of the making of the modern world. And who would have thought 100 years ago, a century ago, that this global epidemic that people experienced all over the world would go into the remote communities of the Great Lakes and be very devastating, and that women would respond to that epidemic by, I always say it's like applying a salve to wounds, that they were able to kind of create this new tradition that is still with us a century later.
Wow. Now, you mentioned earlier that you helped curate an exhibit at the Mille Lacs Indian Museum in Onamaya, which took a look at the history of the jingle dress and was organized for the 100th anniversary of this dance. What kinds of dresses did you have contributed to this exhibit from some of the dancers out there?
Well, it was really fun because we started the exhibit with the idea that we were going to bring historic dresses so that the community could kind of look at what I mentioned earlier, how the dresses evolved over the decades. But then what we also found is there almost became like a second exhibit because women wanted to bring their own jingle dresses into the exhibit as well. And I think the one that is photographed most often is one where it belongs to Vanessa Northrup from the Fond du Lac Ojibwe community in Minnesota. And she turned her police uniform into a jingle dress. And that's a very powerful dress when people see it. Another favorite is the one I mentioned made out of the baking soda can lint. And that was from our spiritual leader from kind of central Minnesota and Wisconsin. His name is Lee Staples. And he asked if we would like to have his mother's dress, which he still had. Lee himself is in his 70s, so he brought in his mother's very beautiful dress, and we added that to the exhibit as well.
It must be just a beautiful sight to see.
Yeah, the exhibit is called Zibaska, Igana Good Day, the jingle dress at 100. And as I said, it will be having another season. Hopefully when the museum reopens again later this spring, it will be there for the summer months as well.
Now, you may have noticed over the last couple of weeks, we've seen women and girls posting videos of themselves dancing jingle online in response to COVID-19. How does it make you feel to see Indigenous people turning back to the jingle dress dance as a dance of healing?
Well, it makes me feel great. It makes me very happy to think that another generation is being inspired by this tradition. You may have noticed early last summer that Google had a doodle in the middle of June about the jingle dress dance. And it was the first time that Google had commissioned a Native artist to make a doodle. And I thought that was a very interesting thing to happen in the last year, too. So it's interesting to me, too, the timing of these particular events, because who would have thought a century after the jingle dress, we'd have another global pandemic. And just at the time we were remembering that history so strongly, that we would have a similar kind of episode in the midst of our country and in our communities. So the timing of this is all very interesting to me.
Well, Brenda, thank you so much. It's been such a fascinating conversation.
Thank you so much, too.
Brenda Child is a professor at the University of Minnesota. She wrote the book, My Grandfather's Knocking Sticks, where she explains that the jingle dress dance was created during the 1919 Spanish flu pandemic. If you want to see some images of jingle dresses, head to our site at cbc.ca/unreserved. This is Unreserved on CBC Radio 1, Sirius XM 169 and Native Voice 1. I'm Rosanna Deerchild. For over 30 years, Cindy Blackstock has been advocating for equal rights for Indigenous children and families. But before Cindy's time, before she was even born, there was a man who, like her, was fighting for the well-being of Indigenous children. His story was hidden for many years until Cindy came along. Dr. Peter Henderson Bryce is not yet a household name in Canada, but Cindy is trying to change that. Cindy Blackstock is the Executive Director of the First Nations Child and Family Caring Society of Canada. She's a member of the Gitxsan First Nation, and she joins me from her home in Ottawa. Cindy, welcome.
Thank you, Rosanna. Good to be here.
So, Cindy, tell me, who was Dr. Peter Henderson Bryce?
Dr. Bryce was a non-Indigenous man, and he was born just outside the Six Nations of the Grand River Reserve in a little town called Mount Pleasant. And he graduated medical school when Canada was only 9 years old, Rosanna. And his specialty really was in public health. So he wrote Ontario's first health code that was replicated all over North America. And he was also president of the American Public Health Association, the founder of the Canadian Public Health Association. So he really was top of his career when at the age of 51, he gets recruited by the government of Canada to be the chief medical health officer at the Indian Department. And this would have been around 1904. And the first task they give him is to send him out to study the health of the children in residential schools, because the top federal bureaucrat at that time, someone by the name of Duncan Campbell Scott, was already receiving reports that up to 50% of the children who were in the schools were dying there. And so they wanted to find out what was happening, and they sent Dr. Bryce out to do the study.
And what did he find?
He found that First Nations children in residential schools and First Nations writ large were receiving only 1/3 of the health funding of just the citizens of Ottawa. And so he said, this is ridiculous. These inequalities in health are resulting in about 50% of the children dying. He said, equalize out that funding and then add in practical reforms, like not putting sick kids in with healthy kids, making sure that the places were sanitary, making sure the children were well fed and weren't exhausted from servitude. He said, end the inequalities, do those practical things, and you could save many of these children's lives. He submitted his report in 1907, and he really believed that once he proved the problem and gave them a solution, the government of Canada would do the right thing. Like, how could anyone allow these kids to die? And so they refused to do it. But Dr. Bryce wasn't silent. His report in 1907 ends up in the newspapers in 1908. And the government was not pleased with this. So they began retaliating against him. They tried to disparage him. They cut all his research funding. They stopped him from presenting at academic conferences because they didn't want this news to get out. And eventually they push him out of the public service. But even then he wasn't silent. He publishes a pamphlet called A National Crime, just over here, a few blocks away from where I live, in a publishing house that still stands called James Hope and Sons. And he distributes that pamphlet all over Ottawa to try and get people's attention.
So how did you come across Dr. Bryce's work?
I came across it actually reading John Malloy's book, A National Crime, which was a telling of the residential school story from the perspective of the Government of Canada's documents, what it knew, when it knew it, and what did it do about it. And he is not a main character in the book, but because Canada erased his history with so much of its propaganda after he stood in courage for the children of residential schools. But he's there, and I thought, that's the example. There's the person who was of that time, who knew better, who stood up for these kids and did everything in his power to make sure that they wouldn't die.
Sometimes we hear people say things like they didn't know back then, they didn't know any better, they didn't realize it was wrong. Many times that argument is used to rationalize Canada's residential schools. What does Dr. Bryce teach us about that way of thinking?
Well, he shows us that that's not right. Not only was he acting out about it, but if you read John Malloy's excellent recital about the Government of Canada's documents in A National Crime, he points to people of all walks of life throughout the residential school period who are raising the alarm about the mistreatment and the deaths of these children. And in fact, one of the people that is in the book is a guy named Sammy Hume Blake, who was a lawyer who in 1908 read the newspapers where Dr. Bryce's report was being revealed and was shocked and horrified. And he wrote in a letter that in that Canada fails to obviate the preventable causes of death, it brings itself into unpleasant nearness with manslaughter. Dr. Bryce's report was often on the front page of newspapers going as far west as the Victoria colonies. So clearly the editors of those papers were shocked by what they heard. It wasn't something that was normalized or excused. It was something that was front page newsworthy. So there are many, many people throughout this history who knew better. And then there's something else, is we know better today as a public. And yet I think that we too often don't rise up and demand an end to really racial discrimination and the provision of public services by the federal government and other governments. We are the people of this period, and we know better, and we can do better. And we risk repeating history if we don't keep on the federal government to end those inequalities.
Mm-hmm. So he's buried, Dr. Bryce is buried in Ottawa, and you go there quite often. Can you describe it to me?
On the day before the apology for residential schools, I actually learned he was buried not far from me in Beechwood Cemetery. So I went and I got a bouquet of brightly colored Gerber daisies because they represented joy of children to me. And I went and I found his grave that is just down a little valley in front of a beautiful maple tree and oak tree. And I told him about the Canadian human rights case that we had filed exactly 100 years after his 1907 report in 2007. Alleging that Canada was discriminating against this generation of kids in ways that caused their harm and unnecessary family separations. And I wanted to thank him for everything that he did. And I go back there often, and now there's a historical plaque there so that kids can learn about Dr. Bryce and be inspired by him just as I was. Dr. Bryce's grave is a very modest tombstone. And I'm so glad to go there now, because when I went there the first time, it was clear that, not many people had come to see him because he was basically erased from Canadian history. Mm-hmm. But now when I go down there, I see poems and stones that people have placed on top of his monument. It's really clear that people are starting to appreciate, many years after he died, what he did and the example he set. And in fact, the man who said no to Dr. Bryce is also buried there, Duncan Campbell Scott.
Now, speaking of Duncan Campbell Scott, and of course he's the man who oversaw the Indian residential school system, the man who stated that his goal was to, quote, get rid of the Indian problem. What did you do when you realized that they were buried in the same cemetery?
Well, it took me a while to go over there. I wanted to learn more about Duncan Campbell Scott. And what I found out is that he actually tragically had a daughter who was sent away at the age of 12 to boarding school, and she died, I believe, of scarlet fever in Paris. By all accounts, he was a loving and doting father, but she's buried on the same site as Duncan Campbell Scott. So I wanted to make sure I was in a good frame of mind when I went there. Mm-hmm. And so I ended up going to see him for the first time just before the Truth and Reconciliation Commission would release its final report. And I went there and I asked his spirit to teach this generation of bureaucrats to do the right thing when they knew better. And I was walking out past, because I put down some tobacco there too. And then I was walking past and I saw he had a plaque. And the plaque was glowing about Duncan Campbell Scott, about all of his, for people who might not know, he was a poet. It was all of his poetry and winning honorary prizes and stuff. So to the credit of Beechwood Cemetery, I got together all of the original documents I could find about Duncan Campbell Scott. And I went over and met with the cemetery. I'd actually thought, well, they're going to resist this. But I said, Duncan Campbell Scott is buried right next to the parking lot where visitors would come. And I said, a lot of residential school survivors may be coming to see Dr. Bryce. And I don't want them to walk by this plaque of Duncan Campbell Scott that's inaccurate. So they said, well, what can we do? They were willing to do something. So I said, well, take down the plaque. And then we'll work with Marie Wilson of the TRC and John Malloy, the historian, and others, and we'll come up with balanced wording for his new plaque. So they said, fine, we'll do it. And even then, I didn't really trust them. So I drove up the next couple of days. And sure enough, the plaque is gone, right? We then, months later, we worked, he doesn't have any living descendants. So we worked with the church where he would have attended, which actually coincidentally is a half block from the Caring Society office. And we had a rather dignified ceremony, wanted to honor his daughter because she was a child. And we put up a new plaque. So the plaque for Duncan Campbell Scott says Confederate poet and cultural genocide on the same plaque.
Wow. How does that feel?
It feels like a balanced telling of history. You know, sometimes I worry when we look back at these people who have done horrendous things like Hitler and Eichmann, etc. We kind of say they're evil and we'll never be like them. And I think it's really important that we humanize these people, that we say that, yes, they did evil things, but they were also these other things. And as we humanize them, we actually make them better teachers because we can see ourselves in them. Anyone who has ever thought, my group is better than this other group because we speak a different language, we have a different culture, whatever. We've all stood at the threshold of the door that Duncan Campbell Scott walked through. And we must always learn from these characters. And we can't just say they're evildoers and separate ourselves out from them. We have to say, now, if I was to raise a child, would I want that child to be more like Dr. Bryce, who maybe was retaliated and suffered for his honesty and for his dignity and his compassion? Or would I want to raise a child like Duncan Campbell Scott, who just before he died writes a letter to his editor saying, I've done nothing courageous in my entire life, and yet was rewarded for his moral cowardice by the bureaucracy and created a context where thousands of children tragically died and many, many, many others suffered. We're still living up his legacy today.
Now, you've been at work restoring Dr. Bryce's legacy, his history. Why do you want Canadians to know about him?
I think what he really shows us is that courage is not a value. It's an activator of values. And he had the moral courage to stand up for others, knowing that he might take a personal hit. And I think that example of moral courage is something we should all learn about. We all have a duty to our fellow human beings, to the land, the animals, and to future generations to be morally courageous, to make sure that when we know better, we do better.
Thank you so much for your time today.
Thanks for the interview.
Cindy Blackstock is the Executive Director of the First Nations Child and Family Caring Society of Canada, a professor at McGill University's School of Social Work. She is a member of the Gitxsan First Nation. You're listening to Unreserved on CBC Radio 1, Sirius XM 169 and Native Voice 1. I'm Rosanna Deerchild, talking all about little-known history on the show today. The Secret Life of Canada is a podcast that takes deep dives into little-known aspects of this country's history. Phelan Johnson is the co-host of the podcast, and she joins me now. Welcome, Phelan.
Hi.
So, Phelan, with a name like Secret Life of Canada, it's clear your show is all about uncovering things. What was the first story that made you think that this would work well as a podcast?
Our first episode was on Banff and how Banff National Park was built by interned prisoners during World War I. But really, you know, there were so many stories. When my co-host Leah and I met, to talk about the idea, it was sort of just we were having coffee and she was like, we should start a podcast. And I was like, okay, sure. Which I think is the way most podcasts start in all reality. Yeah. But we kind of sketched out 12 episodes just sitting there having coffee because there really is no shortage of things to talk about. I think, growing up Indigenous in Canada, in the 80s and 90s and going to history class, there was definitely something missing. And so, all we had to do was look at what was missing in the margins of our high school history books to find stories to talk about.
For sure. Now, since the podcast launched, you've done a lot of stories on little-known histories. What's one that's really stayed with you?
I mean, there are so many. We did an episode on the Indian Act, and that also is, I think, something, it was good for me to do that episode because I realized, in the research and trying to unpack it, how little I actually knew about this document that still governs so much of our lives.
Mm-hmm. It certainly is a mystery to many people. How much do you think the average Canadian knows about the Indian Act?
Oh, Not enough. Not enough at all. And, and I have to say, I have to admit that I was a part of that. I definitely didn't know as much as I should have, which is, kind of why I wanted to look into it, because I wanted to become more knowledgeable about it. And I wanted to know, where it started and how it came to be, and also learn how it transformed over the years.
You asked a few people about what they knew. Let's take a listen to how they responded to that.
Do you know what the Indian Act is?
Indian Act? Off the top of my head, I'm not 100% certain.
No idea.
I knew there was some laws, and I just didn't know what it was called.
I don't know why you still call it the Indian Act when it's politically incorrect.
The Indian Act, like the Redskin Act,
It reflects the mindset of the time that when it was created.
Does the Indian Act affect your life in any way?
No, not really, no.
I don't think so. I still don't really know what it is. So.
Yeah. So I'm sure there are other people that are affected by this every day. I'm just not one of them.
That was an excerpt from the Secret Life of Canada's podcast episode about the Indian Act. Now, Phelan, this episode digs very deeply into the act, a very complex thing, as you said, to try and unpack. What was the biggest challenge with doing a show like that?
Well, it's not a very, if you read the Indian Act now, it's been amended so many times, and it is, in legalese. So trying to wrap your brain around reading the thing and understanding it and contextualizing it so that, your everyday person who, isn't a lawyer or a politician can understand it. So making it understandable, I think, was the biggest challenge. And then, trying to explain how it is still relevant and, how it is a thing that I think impacts not just Indigenous people, but also non-Indigenous people in this country, because, you can't have the haves without the have-nots. And so, just trying to make it exciting in a way, but also trying to make it accessible for people.
Sure. Let's take a listen to another clip from that episode where you explain the goal of the Indian Act.
In 1857, the responsibility for Indian affairs had passed from Britain to the province of Canada.
Wait.
Because don't forget, we're pre-Confederation here.
Right, so it's a province of Britain.
Yes.
Essentially,
yes,
right. Okay,
yes.
Gotcha.
And so one of the first items of business that they had, this new department, was to pass a statute called an Act for the Gradual Civilization of the Indian Tribes of Canada. This now meant the province of Canada was in charge. The Gradual Civilization Act really was the precursor to the Indian Act. It held many of the same ideals, and it sought to push enfranchisement on Indigenous people.
Now, enfranchisement, that word, it's usually connected with something good, like getting the right to vote or being able to participate more in a free society. But in the case of the Indian Act, it meant that Indigenous people could become citizens, but they would have to give up traditional rights and go against the agreement they had in place through this royal proclamation and the Treaty of Niagara. Remember that wampum belt we were talking about?
Yes, exactly. The Act wanted Indians to become citizens. If an Indigenous man was 21 years or older and could prove that he didn't have debt, could speak English or French, was quote-unquote of good moral character, he could be given land for farming. If after a year he was able to prove that he was living as a white man, he would be considered civilized and granted his land, and then he could vote.
That's a clip from the Secret Life of Canada's episode about the Indian Act. That podcast is hosted by Phelan Johnson and Leah Simone Bowen. Phelan is with me on the show today. Now, you just started with season 3 of the podcast. Is there an upcoming episode you're particularly looking forward to?
Yeah. So our first full-length episode of the 3rd season is called Sasquatch in the Gift Shop, which I think is a very cute title. So I do say so myself. And so what we look at is we look at a land-based creature and a water creature, both based in Indigenous oral history, and try and find the roots of them. So we look at Sasquatch and Ogopogo. I put Ogopogo in quotes because that's not an Indigenous name. But yeah, so we go to the West Coast and we take a look at where they come from and just how they ended up from being these, deeply spiritual beings to, ending up on tacky T-shirts and being, source material for a lot of terrible movies in the 80s.
I love that. I'm a big Sasquatch fan,
Oh yeah, no, you got to take a listen then. It's pretty good. I'm pretty happy with it. And I think it feels like the right tone for, the strangeness of the world right now.
Mm-hmm. Let's take a listen to a bit from that new episode where you explain where the word Sasquatch comes from.
So, in fact, the word Sasquatch comes from the Coast Salish word Saskats, which in Hulkamelam call means hairy or wild man.
And so we learn once again that a lot of the words we use in English and French are a variation of a word from an Indigenous language.
It is. So the St'elas have been living in the Fraser Valley for thousands of years, and Sasquatch has always been a central figure in their community, a shapeshifter, a supernatural, spiritual being. To see one can mean good luck and can be a good omen. Sasquatch was and is very much a part of St'elas people's culture, and for many people, he's a symbol of the land, of our responsibility to take care of the earth.
So how did we get from that to some of the ridiculous incarnations of Sasquatch now? Like, how do we end up with this sacred being tied to a Chewbacca? And please don't send me messages about how Chewbacca is sacred. I know he is to some of you, but that's not what we're talking about now. Yeah, but like this idea of like a cartoon character almost. How did we end up with that?
So when Canada happened and the Indian Act was put into place in Indigenous communities, an Indian agent would have been put sort of in charge of that community. And these officials, they were in charge of enforcing the Indian Act.
Which meant
telling Indigenous people what they could and couldn't do. Much of the Indian Act was about suppressing Indigenous culture, language, and way of life. So this was the case in the St'elas community. There was a man, their Indian agent, his name was J.W. Burns, and he was there in the 20s and 30s. And the community was actually really kind to him. They even shared some of their Sasquatch stories with him.
That's very generous of them.
Yeah, Burns was fascinated with the stories, and he even wrote an article for Maclean's titled Introducing BC's Hairy Giants. And it featured stories from some of the St'elas people who claimed to have encountered the Sasquatch. The article was published on April 1st, 1929.
April Fool's Day.
Yeah.
And it wasn't a joke, though.
No, but some thought it might be. So in this article, Burns used the word Sasquatch instead of Saskats, which is how we ended up with Sasquatch.
That was a bit from a new episode of The Secret Life of Canada, co-hosted by Phelan Johnson and Leah Simone Bowen. That episode is out today, and trust me, the story just gets weirder. So grab it from wherever you get your podcasts. Phelan, thanks for sharing some of your favorite little-known history stories from the podcast with us.
Absolutely. Anytime.
Phelan Johnson is co-host of the CBC podcast, The Secret Life of Canada. Sometimes a piece of history can be found in a bead or a stitch. 4 years ago, Métis poet Gregory Schofield began repatriating historical beadwork and craftwork from First Nations and Métis women. An avid antiques collector, the more pieces Gregory repatriated, the more history he uncovered in the intricate floral patterns. Recently, he began to share that history through short videos that he posts on social media. Gregory joins me from his home in Victoria. Hello and welcome.
Dante.
Good. Now, first of all, let's talk a little bit about your personal story and connection to beadwork. What is your long and storied history with it?
Right. Well, my story with beadwork and sewing started when I was probably about 8. And that was growing up at my auntie's table. Now, she was an avid beadworker. She was also a seamstress. She was a Cree speaker and an amazing storyteller. So from the time I was about 8, I was very fortunate to be not only learning Cree from her, but to be listening and hearing and learning a lot of stories. And at some point, I took an interest in beadwork, and the rest is history.
And certainly it is. How did this journey of bringing beaded items home begin for you?
Well, really, I think there were many different reasons why I started collecting. I think the first thing is that I noticed as I was visiting a lot of museums across the country that I would always look for Métis specific pieces. And oftentimes a lot of our pieces were being folded in with other First Nations work, whether that was, Cree work, whether that was Anishinaabe work. Our work was also being folded in with, displays on early Victoriana needlework. So my interest really began about thinking specifically our own Cree Métis specific pieces and the work that a lot of the women were doing back then, and how that particular style, whether it was beadwork, whether it was embroidery, silk work, how that particular style was very characteristic of the work that was being done by Cree and Cree Métis women and girls throughout the Northwest in the 19th century.
Do you remember the first piece that you managed to find and bring home?
I think there were two pieces that I actually had found. The first piece was a very old ceinture fléchée, so a very old sash, a finger-woven sash. Wow. And I remember finding that online, and I was really excited about being able to get it, because, of course, there's nothing more symbolic of the Métis Nation than the sash. So I found a sash, and I think the second piece that I found was a child's hat, which was in the style of an old-time smoking hat. I had found this small, beautifully beaded, florally beaded hat and found that in the UK.
Wow, that's amazing. And is that when you got hooked?
Well, I think the thing is that I had always been hooked because, of course, I've always had a love of antiques. I've always had a love of history, a love of old things, and of course, with the many years that I've spent in museums and in museum archives and, in various parks across Canada, I've always had this incredible interest toward old things.
Yeah. Now, since then, you've managed to bring home a couple hundred pieces. And in studying them, what have you learned about who made these pieces and why?
Well, the incredible thing with a lot of these pieces, a number of the pieces in the collection, I guess, would be considered tourist item pieces. Now, in the 19th century, a lot of Métis women were sewing for the tourist market. There was very famous work that was coming out of a community in northern Manitoba, a community called Norway House. And the women were very, very well known for their beautiful silk embroidery work. So everything from moccasins to wall pockets to hanky holders to napkin rings to jackets, vests, all kinds of things that tourists that were visiting that particular community would buy and, take across the world with them.
You mentioned earlier the Norway House gauntlets with the embroidery work. Now, you shared a really interesting story with me earlier about those gauntlets and how you came to find some of them and bring them together.
These particular gauntlets are not from Norway House. They're from Manitoba. They're very characteristic of the work that was being done in the Red River settlement in the mid-19th century. So I had found a beautiful pair of gauntlets in the United Kingdom. And about a year later, which was actually not too long ago, I found a very similar pair of gauntlets in an auction house in Philadelphia. So, of course, I was able, I was very fortunate to be able to get the second pair of gauntlets. And when they arrived, I realized that both of these gauntlets had been made by the exact same woman.
What?
That there was the exact same embroidery threads. It was the exact same style of embroidery.
Wow. So it really speaks to how far some of this work went.
For me, it's like I like to believe too that, I hope that the woman who created those pieces, I hope that, she guided those pieces to me and that she helped me bring them back home. I mean, it's really amazing when you think about finding, one artist's work in two very different places. In this whole journey, of repatriating items and, this whole kind of idea of bringing items home. I always tell people that I'll find pieces and it's almost like they're children that have been adopted out. And I want so much to bring them home. I want so much to connect them back to their histories, connect them back to communities if possible. And, I really wish that a lot of these pieces came with the names of the ancestor grandmothers who had worked on those pieces.
And why do you think it's important to share this history?
I think it's really important that as we look at those pieces from the past, that we're also able to, start thinking about the women that created those pieces and why those pieces were being created. Like the analogy of the children that I talked about earlier with, finding these pieces and wanting to bring them home. It's one thing about finding them and about bringing them home, but it's also another thing to be able to give them names and to be able to give them communities.
That's beautiful. Thank you so much for your time today, Gregory.
Absolutely.
Gregory Schofield curates a private collection of historical beadwork and craftwork from Indigenous women. His memoir, Thunder Through My Veins, has just been reissued for its 20th anniversary. That's it for this week's episode of Unreserved. We'll be back in this radio space next week for more community, culture, and conversation. This episode was produced by Zoe Tennant, Stephanie Cram, Kyle Musica, and Anna Lazowski. I'm your favorite cousin, Rosanna Deerchild, coming at you from Winnipeg in Treaty 1 territory. Thank you for listening to Unreserved on CBC Radio 1. Egosay.
For more CBC podcasts, go to cbc.ca/podcasts.